Here in the United States, we have a gun culture that goes all the way back to before the founding of the nation. The idea that guns are regular tools that can be owned by people because they have the right to defend themselves is just kind of built in. And it continues to this very day, even often among people who intellectually don't agree with this concept. They still kind of have it in them, some of these basic presuppositions. But what about other cultures in different countries that don't have this same fundamental starting point? Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk, and I have here Henry, my friend. We've talked several times. You know Henry as one of the hosts of Nine Hole Reviews, and he's been on the T-Rex Talk podcast before, so we shouldn't need too much of an introduction. But welcome back, Henry. And as always, it's good talking to you. Even though for the listeners at home, we're only just beginning our conversation. We've already started the conversation. It's already a good conversation. So thanks for coming on the show again and talking publicly about stuff that we usually just kind of phone call about.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's certainly I wish I could be in person right now because I certainly have a lot more fun hanging out in person.
Oh, it's much more fun right now. It's 18 degrees outside and had to drive to work very slowly through the snow. So yes, It would be much more fun if you were here.
Now, I will say, as far as our channel goes, while I do mention little bits and pieces of my background, places I've been to and things like that, I don't fully delve into my life story. So this is certainly a first.
Yeah. Well, I would love to. So first of all, we've talked about your history. I think it's fascinating. But in addition to you as a person, you are also a fascinating opportunity to explore firearm culture in different places because not only do you currently reside in the most probably firearm heavy state in the United States and own more guns than the average Texan, you also have some experience in the U.S. military. You also have some experience growing up in a country with basically zero civilian firearm ownership. So you have seen a vast swath of the world in different ways that different cultures experience firearm ownership or the lack thereof. And then when you were in the military, you also deployed in places that had their own interesting cultures. So I would love to get your insight into some of these different things. But yeah, let's just start out. Like, where were you born? Where did you grow up? Like, what was the gradual progression around the world for you?
Yeah, so to sort of draw an overarching sort of picture of what were my journey into firearms, I'd say it's sort of like missionary work. I mean, I know you guys talk about being Christian and all that. I am. I'm Catholic. We go to church every weekend, and we have I very much enjoy being active with a faith and with my family. But it's sort of like someone who gets converted or even evangelized in a sense. And that's sort of how my journey was. Because at one point in my life, because of where I grew up with, I could not fathom civilian ownership of just normal firearms, much less some of the hardware that both of us have handled on our channels. That is just completely out of the question. And so I kind of wanted to continually draw back to that process of evangelization, I suppose. If that
have you heard the Gospel of John Moses Browning? Yes, yeah.
Well, in sort of what's effective evangelization, is actually living a Christian life and being close to someone, and it's not just telling someone something, but demonstrating that it is the way.
Yes. Weapons are part of our religion. Yeah. Well, there's a fascinating aspect to that as well. And I experienced this as I've traveled around the world. It's very easy to tell somebody in this country, they do this. In this country, they do that. In this culture, this is the stereotype. And it's very easy to know that in your mind, but it's another thing to experience it. So I was in Egypt for a real short amount of time, like 2 weeks. And I knew that Egypt was an Islamic country. I knew that there were going to be mosques everywhere and minarets everywhere. I knew that there was going to be the call to prayer. I knew all of this stuff. I'd studied a little tiny bit of Arabic. Like, I knew all this stuff in my head. But after 2 weeks of being in Egypt, it is a very different thing to fully experience the immersion. And so, yes, you can tell people, in the United States, firearms are just another tool. It's very hard to actually fully appreciate the culture once you've been steeped in it. So that old question, does a fish know he's wet? Well, of course a fish doesn't know he's wet. He has no concept of an alternative to being wet. Cultures are very powerful, super low level. Like your culture isn't even your operating system. Your culture is the BIOS that your operating system is running on. And then there's the operating system that you're running on. And then there's these apps that you install. And if you just install guns like as an app, or you just look up guns in Wikipedia in your browser, like that's not the same as having a system level understanding or system level core processors that include private firearm ownership and the personal right to self-defense. Like that should be a low level core BIOS bare metal install set of instructions for humans, not something that you tell them about later and it just kind of sits somewhere on top inside of maybe a browser plugin. Like it needs to be core, fundamental, basic stuff.
Well, I think when societies sort of outlaw something enough to where it's unattainable, it turns into It turns into what is this concept? It's sort of like, I mean, this is cliche going back to 1984 and saying how can we control the vocabulary to remove certain thoughts, right? So in this instance, removing the idea of having firearms removes the thought of using firearms itself. And I'm in the States, it's even the US. So sort of your example of Egypt, in Egypt, you have a lot of Christians in Egypt. I mean, people forget that was the ancient crossroads for many different cultures and religions. And in the U.S., you have a certain amount. Just because you're American doesn't mean that you love guns. The culture in New York, L.A., Chicago is far different from the culture here in Texas, or where you are in Tennessee, or might I add, the trifecta, Florida.
Yes, the big three. Yeah.
And where this conversation with Isaac started came from talking about the culture differences between some of these places, even in the U.S., versus where we are and how we viewed firearms. And so for me, I was born in Texas. I was born in the U.S., but I was raised in Hong Kong. And there's a classic story here where, as I was growing up, I told my parents that because nobody around me in Fort Worth, Texas, spoke Chinese to me. I was a son of a Chinese restaurant owner in the middle of Cowtown, and I remembered one day I vehemently insisted to my parents that, why do we speak Chinese? Chinese is useless. Nobody in the world speaks Chinese. It is stupid. That was the last of it. I was within the year I was on a flight to Hong Kong, and I still didn't know what was going on. But the first culture shock was there. It was just with language. And even though I was born in the States, I have memories from the States. I left at such a young age that linguistically I could speak English. I mean, Chinese, I could speak it. I couldn't read or write it. By the time I went to Hong Kong, it was completely different. I had to use this language that I had deemed useless, that I said nobody else in the world uses. Little did I know.
Cantonese or Mandarin?
I learned Cantonese to begin with, but so Chinese, the written Chinese is largely the same. It is the same. But the spoken Chinese is different between the dialects. And not so different that you wouldn't be able to fully translate the two, but different enough to where someone who just speaks Mandarin would never understand what I'm saying in Cantonese. And someone who speaks Cantonese could understand some Mandarin, but not very well. But when I went to Hong Kong, I had to learn all of that. This was the late years of the British colonial days. So I've made some content on the Royal Hong Kong Police and the old days of the UK rule. And so that was a vital part of my upbringing and growing up, or seeing the green police officer, the green outfits, the green uniforms that the Royal Hong Kong Police wore, the non-air conditioned double-deckered buses. You'll know if you ever go to Hong Kong, there's a lot of most of the landmarks over on the island side are like Victoria Harbour, Salisbury Road. I mean, very British influence society, and the streets, even the street lights, the pedestrian walkway dividers, all of those things are UK standard. So you take someone from Hong Kong, you drop them in the UK, the things in the streets, the street lights, the street lamps, so they all look the same.
I remember being kind of confused watching some Jackie Chan movies. There's parts of the Jackie Chan movies like, did they shoot this in London? Why would they do that? Why would Golden Harvest go to London to shoot this part of the movie? Yeah.
Yeah, it's in Hong Kong, on Hong Kong Island, especially in the financial district in Central. Parts of it really does look like the UK took parts of London and transported it to Hong Kong. And so I grew up during that time frame of the late time in Hong Kong and this is when Sir Christopher Patten had introduced democracy to Hong Kong, much to the CCP's dislike. He worked to introduce part of the popular vote to Hong Kong to help influence the legislative branch of Hong Kong, although it wasn't a full integration. But as far as firearms go, I would confidently say that Hong Kong is perhaps stricter than the UK. And so in the UK, at the very least, you could not easily, but you could get licenses to do manually operated 22s or things like that to still be in a small bore competition sphere. Pistols were obviously not very easily attainable in the UK, and you had to have those long rods in the UK. But at the very least, in the 90s, the shooting culture in the UK, while it was rapidly declining, it was still not fully declined.
Yeah.
In Hong Kong, however, it's exceedingly difficult to own a firearm or shoot a firearm. And most people who own firearms have to lock it away at the shooting club. Mm-hmm. They have to count the casings upon returning, basically do a brass check before they go back for everything that they purchased, because Hong Kong is exceedingly restrictive on firearms. It's a colony. It's not UK proper. It's just not, and it's a colony of British people who took over a Chinese culture. Both cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The Chinese culture has been very leery of firearms ownership, because a lot of the previous revolutions in Chinese history has always involved civilians using, farmers using plows and axes to start revolutions, and then acquiring arms. The hunters having their own bows and arrows, and that causing dynasties to be overturned.
Right. So this weapon control is baked in for centuries and centuries. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of Chinese martial arts are built around using non-weapons for combat, specifically because so much weapon control has been present. Yeah.
And so the 80s and the 90s were also a time frame when there were a lot of organized firearm crimes making headway in Hong Kong.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And a lot of the firearms, because Hong Kong's an open port. I mean, it's not a fully open port. You can't just drive in with loads of drugs and distribute it. That's not what it means by open port.
Not
it's just
quite.
it's open to business for everybody. Is what it is. So,
and it's in the middle of the Golden Triangle. There's all kinds of stuff going on in the 80s in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and the main I've been meaning to make a video on our channel on some of the crime guns in Hong Kong because it's fascinating. You know how the States, your Tech 9s and high point pistols, that's the gangbangers.
Classic crime guns. Yeah.
Those are the bangers' choices here. And it's not their choice because, well, the Tech 9 maybe is because it looks menacing.
Yes.
So if you gangster lean with a Tech 9, that's certainly a scary moment. That brace yourself, fool moment. But the reason for things like high points is because they work and they're cheap.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very utilitarian choice. So it's in a very same vein. The bangers in Hong Kong, traditionally the local gangs would use a lot of knives and blades. They would conceal watermelon knives, which look like straight samurai swords, I guess. Best way I could describe it. They would conceal machetes. And so in Hong Kong, when the local gangs usually had any kerfuffles, they call it pek yao, which means to chop dudes. And so you would get rival gangs to do this battle royale, and it's just massively bloody, and it's all over the place. Let's just say that. The 80s and the 90s were a time frame when some gangs, some entrepreneurs started recruiting from outside of Hong Kong. And there were some guys who figured out the illegal immigration routes into Hong Kong, and they would recruit former PLA fighters or former PLA soldiers or veterans. And this is a time frame. Remember, this is after China went into Vietnam in '79.
Right. Yeah.
So you had some hard guys. You had some hard guys who had seen some real combat, and so they would they would go around to find people who were able to handle themselves, and they would also, outside of transporting the people in, they would also transport weapons from China. So Type 56s were used in some cases. Type 56s being the Chinese version of the AK Type 3 with a stamped receiver. That's probably too nerdy to get into. An AK.
Was there any flow of weapons from Afghanistan and Russia? Because these are,
Yes.
bordering countries that have a very large flow of ammunition. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of proxy wars happening.
Very much
in other parts of the world, so a lot of stuff can theoretically find its way into Hong Kong.
The easiest still were Chinese weapons because the Type 56, what they call the Black Star pistol, which is a Tokarev pistol, it's got a black star on it. That's why it's a Black Star pistol. And then the Red Star pistol. Sometimes the Makarovs that the Chinese had cloned had red bakelite grips, so that's the Red Star pistol. The infamous two firearms, but most certainly the Tokarev, the TT-33, or the Chinese Type 54. That is synonymous with gangbangers out in the Far East. It was easily slipped through Chinese armories on the way out. I mean, back in the 80s and the 90s, briberies are still rampant right now, but even more so during the late Cold War eras in China. And so you just bribe a guy, get loads of Black Star pistols, ship them to Hong Kong. And they called, like one guy named Yip Kai Fun is the English name. It just translates the way it's read. Nickname Mad Dog. He had his band of what they called Sangong Keeping, which is like provincial Hong Kong flag soldiers. So they're mercenaries that he hired to go to Hong Kong with Type 54 Black Star pistols, and he would brandish a Type 56, and they would go to the jewelry stores. So Hong Kong, they've got jewelry districts, and so all the gold stores. Oh
yes,
all along one street.
It's extremely segmented, kind of like New York used to be 100 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, people need to remember there was commerce before the internet. And
yes,
for the way a lot of cities were laid out before the internet, there were districts where all these things were sold. And it's because people don't want to go look at jewelry, on the Hong Kong island side and then bounce over onto the Kowloon Peninsula and then go to the new territories. No, like all the jewelry is concentrated around the jewelry district in Hong Kong. And so from someone who has a military mind, you start seeing targets of opportunity really concentrated. And then
choke points, access points. Yes, yes.
It was he planned his heist out very, very strategically. So he would choke off the road with 2 lookouts with Type 56s, and then they would just go down the street and one by one just take the jewelry stores. And I still remember the memories of seeing this on the news, specifically the guys with the AKs. The way they blocked off the streets for the Hong Kong police to access, they would just hose the street when the police were trying to come through to stop them. And the police were running Smith & Wesson 38 specials.
Classic British stuff. Yeah.
Very anemic, opposed to even the Black Star pistol, but especially more so if someone's spraying an AK at you. And so they would. Yeah. This was a huge issue in Hong Kong, especially a society that is so disarmed that the gangsters would use blades to fight each other with. This is a huge shock to the society. And so growing up as a boy, I remembered watching the evening news that Yip Kai Fun had knocked off another, heist in this area. I mean, you think these things are from movies in Hong Kong. Like,
yeah, I think I saw Jackie Chan fight him a couple of times. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, this is oddly based off of a reality. So as a boy, I knew, okay, so there's this idea in the Hong Kong, people in the Hong Kong, there's this psyche in the Southern Chinese culture that guns like that are not for the civilized people. These are for the bandits. These are, that's who accesses these things. And the police will come and try to save the day. And the Hong Kong version of the SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics, is called the Special Duties Unit, the SDU. And they're trained by the SAS with CQB tactics and all sorts. Basically, imagine if the SAS took a law enforcement role. That's what the SDU is like. And those are the guys who had the heavy armament. But sometimes the cops could pull out MP5s and shotguns if they needed something more. But it was a very segmented, like ROE, sort of like like a video game. You have different tiers of people to respond to these things. Then
we kind of had that a little bit in the States in the 1930s, where for a long time you have pretty much clear parity. Every cowboy, every bandit, every Indian, like after the Civil War, that time period, everybody has a Winchester repeater, everybody has a 6-shooter. Everybody is basically on par. Everyone knows what the weapons tech is. When you start to see gangsters in the 20s and the 30s shooting people with Thompson submachine guns, that's when you get this, like, these are gangster guns, and these don't, people don't need these things. that's where that idea kind of takes hold. But it doesn't actually result in the states disarming. We passed some really bad laws, obviously. NFA, 1934. Like, we passed some very bad gun control laws. But regular people were like, no, I'll still carry a pistol. No, I'll still carry a rifle. No, I'll still have rifles and shotguns in the gun rack of my truck. So we did kind of demonize a couple of kinds of guns and so forth, but the people did not see bandit firearms and retract. And you're saying that's what the people of Hong Kong did. They didn't see gunfire in the streets and think, I should have a gun to protect myself. A greater gap kind of opened up.
Yeah, it's part of the Chinese culture, to be honest. The I need to be careful. I'm not trying to say collectivism as in communism. There's a huge difference here. It's just the Chinese culture is always about collectivism, doing better for the greater good for society. Now, obviously, there are parallels between what communism preaches, which is why to some Chinese people it was a lot easier to sell than to the West. But it is a very classic Confucian idea for that collectivism thought. And so part of that is how can you efficiently protect your society? And how do you think collectively on security rather than individually, right? So a big part of that Chinese culture is less so about, how can I protect myself? It's more so, what can I do for the society to protect itself? And so when you think about this, how this could be perversed, could be, again, I need to be careful here. If you were in power, you could easily say that for the greater good, let's take these things away so people cause less issues, which is why you see the local gangsters in Hong Kong using knives instead of guns, even though they could be easily obtained. It's just
interesting.
It was just not in the mind for people to use guns at all. And so it was so detached from the Hong Kong society that for civilian ownership of firearms, but even more than that, the civilian use of firearms for self-defense, and I would say a level above that is the civilian ownership of firearms to politically check your the dynastic powers or whomever is in charge. What we in the U.S. use firearms as for the Second Amendment, that is so far out of the vocabulary and the mindset of someone in the Far East that when I came back from Hong Kong to the States, and mind you, I came back to the States during the time frame when we were doing public exams. And that's a big deal in Hong Kong because the public exams drives which school you then go to. It's kind of like the SATs or the ACTs, but on steroids. You study for
it's
for 2 years.
another one of these sort of collective ideas. The test, the nationwide test. The Hong Kong had its version. It's UK based, but the Chinese culture focuses on these so much that you essentially take 2 years to study for this. I was a bit fed up with that, and I had a few long conversations with my parents. And this was years, of course, I was a teenager at this point. My parents saw that I actively didn't fit. This was not like me in the States saying, "Oh, nobody speaks Chinese, so Chinese is useless." That's not what was going on here. I was a little older. I was a teenager, and I told them that I didn't like that people were just memorizing things because I would ask them exactly what is the theory behind it, and they couldn't tell me, but they could solve like a calculus problem. So there's some disconnect right here to where you're not actually learning the topic versus you're very good at taking the test. I did not want to be in that type of culture because I wanted to learn. I wanted to actually understand what the books were trying to teach.
And so that was a big point on why I had a lot of conversation with parents for coming back to the States to finish out school and go to university here instead of Hong Kong. Specifically, it's because I disagreed with the idea of just memorizing and spitting things out. I wanted to actively learn. And so when I came back to the States for university, I remember I still could not understand how people could have firearms all over the place. And I remember at first I was thinking, oh, it can't be as bad as the what they say in the news that everybody has guns. Of course, I ended up
it's the Wild West. Yeah.
I mean, because in the movies, right? In the movies, like all these guys, everybody has guns in America. And I came to the States, and at first, I mean, obviously this was the 2000s, and nobody's brandishing guns in the streets like the movies.
We're still escaping from our Clinton era weapons ban. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was the time I didn't think much about it. And they, some of the kids in the local high school, and I went to public school, by the way. So it was a very direct immersion into American, like a cross section of American society. And I remember kids were talking about shooting Deagles and AR-15s, and I was like, "Oh, you mean an M16?" It's like, "No, it's an AR-15." It's like, "What's the difference?" This one does semi. I was like,
"Yeah,
who cares if it does semi or full auto if it's that thing?" So I remember coming from a perspective of, this looks the same to me. This looks like those things that people commit crimes in Hong Kong with. I don't think that's a good idea for everyone to own it, because I could understand the idea of self-protection, even though I at the point I felt that if you had a good enough police force, that's why Hong Kong had a good police force. But then the social contract in the Far East is so strong. I mean, you place so much faith in that social contract that the government will provide, that you don't think for yourself. And part of that, again, going back to the collective mindset, I think there's a certain thing behind the collective mindset. I think it could be easily demonized, but then at the same time, I cannot brush aside some of the advances that China has made in the last 20, 30 years based off of that collective mindset. Now, a lot of those advances have been made with the expense of the people and their individual lives and freedoms and what they desire. But if that freedom was never a part of the concept, I mean,
you wouldn't notice as much. Yeah,
correct.
The resentment would theoretically not be there, even though the other negative aspects would. Yeah.
So I specifically remembered when I came back to the States and I was going to university, my college roommate, I had two roommates as a freshman. One of them was a Frenchman. The other was a country boy from East Texas. And I thought I would have more in common with a Frenchman to begin with, because I came from, well, I mean, I don't know why I would think so. I came from a very Anglo-centric society to where you made fun of the Frenchmen all the time. But I ended up becoming very, very close with my East Texas roommate because I didn't always spend time back home in Hong Kong. It was expensive to buy tickets every single time. And so I ended up spending a lot of holidays in East Texas, and that's what opened. That itself was one of the key things that opened my mind to the gun culture here. What isn't being portrayed over in Hong Kong is some of the faux pas. You know, the four safety rules. Never point your muzzle at something you're not intending to destroy. Those rules, that's not being preached overseas. The disciplines I got into when I was here, learning from guys who were deep in the service rifle competition side, very much promoted things that were discipline based. I have never been someone who's interested in shooting rounds into trash. If you are, that's fine. It's just not me. And so I was very much attracted to shooting with purpose and trying to learn the craft. And so one part actually I left out. How did I get interested in guns in the first place when Hong Kong was so restrictive?
Yeah.
Was it just Lucas, or did you get to meet Liku, the Japanese airsoft?
I have met Liku. I didn't get to spend very much time with him because one of my children was born, I think, the day after he arrived in the States. So I didn't get to spend as much time with him as some of the other guys. But yeah, we had some minutes together for sure.
So I watched that episode a few times, and I definitely related to it very much. Hong Kong and Japan and Taiwan are places that the airsoft industry have had significant growth. While guns in all three of these locations are highly restricted, the interest in how they work and what they are most certainly is not. You cannot take that interest away from people. Now, to a certain extent, airsoft is even illegal in mainland China. But judging by some of the anime and the fan boards and things for firearms and discussion boards, the interest towards small arms most certainly is there. It's just the practical knowledge of employing it is not there in the Far East.
Right. Yeah.
And I will say that as a collective, I don't think the practical knowledge is there. Now, there are exceptions. I mean, Korea, you have to serve. In South Korea, you have to serve. So it's not like you're completely devoid of any knowledge of these things. But
yeah,
these are also some of those militaries that when you go to the range, you have a man with a net next to your ejection port to catch every single brass that comes out. So still very strict on everything firearms related. And so if you look at all the landscape of airsoft as an indication on whether people are interested in firearms, I would say most definitely yes, very yes, people are interested in these things. But you just can't own it. And the side that tells people this is a public security threat outweighs that interest itself. And so, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. So that is going back to my computer analogy, like being interested in a topic and downloading all the information about it and having the head knowledge is different from owning it, not even owning the physical thing, but like owning the topic. Like a difference might also be between like young guys who love supercars. They'll never own one, but they watch Top Gear and they have the wallpaper on they have the posters on their wall, the wallpaper on their computer of, whatever the latest Bugatti is. But then there's guys who love cars and they're never going to have one of those things, but they are building stuff in their garage. They are messing around with stuff. They are taking things out to the track. And there's something fundamentally different about that. It kind of goes back to a problem that you were having in Hong Kong. The memorization of Bugatti Veyron facts is loving cars, sort of, but you haven't really, you're not getting the grease under your fingernails. Like it's not in your blood.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a huge difference, And airsoft is basically, in my opinion, as close to actually shooting guns as you can get.
Right. Yeah.
because these things are
Yeah.
the level, the facilities that these things provide, the level of a training tool as they can be is incredible. The amount of detail going into them is amazing. So
That's almost more like, to pair it to the car analogy, airsofters are the guys who are driving go-karts, and you can laugh at them, but there's a lot of go-kart drivers that have become race car drivers and done very well as professional drivers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Liku's an amazing example of that. You know, the guy was able to develop a basic set of skills being interested in airsoft. And when you put him on a wet range, he just took to it. Now, what they don't teach, however, are the basic safety elements of owning firearms or actual ballistics of using firearms. And so there's elements that are very difficult to achieve unless you actually get hands-on. I would say, so the way, if I were to predate this, I don't know if you, this may be an obscure game, but have you ever seen there's a 90s game called Commandos? It's like a few different characters that you can use, and you're using this commando team to do all sorts of infiltration into World War II Germany.
It's not ringing a bell. I might recognize screenshots, but I never played it.
Yeah, so it was one of those like really cheap games that I was able to afford when I went to the computer. And again, Hong Kong having concentrated stores, you have computer shopping centers where the whole shopping center is nothing but computer components and software, and everything was still on either floppy disks or CDs were the new thing.
Yeah,
and so
the golden age. Yes.
Oh yeah. The pirated CDs. I bought a pirated version of Commandos as a young boy, and I thought it was such a cool game, and all the characters were so cool. But there was one, and it was the sniper. The sniper fascinated me because he was a problem solver if you had a problem from far away. Yes, everybody will be alerted when you touch that rifle off, but he was a problem solver. But that type of stuff, that was one of the first things that sort of got me interested in. So there's different classes of firearms, and they could do different things when you put them in the right hands.
Yeah.
And so that put me in a position to constantly go to the library to read about these things and see like what differences can different things make. And I was naturally history. I was interested in history, so I was about to say like I was a historical file. I don't know if that's an actual word, but yeah. I was naturally interested in history, and so trying to, looking at this video game that was based in World War II, and then getting to go to the library to read about guns more and more. And this is before a lot of nonsense, so even the British Hong Kong libraries had a lot of firearms-based books for people to do research on.
This is one of the things that I enjoyed about living in New Zealand is getting a taste of the British military historic works and some of the British publications, and some of their different military colleges and things would have journals and books and stuff that I'm sure you can find them in the States, but that was just regular New Zealand public library stuff. And that was pretty neat. And then we were also there for the purge. When these things became politically incorrect, we bought a ton of that stuff at library book sales. So David Botkin has a bunch of that in his office.
So my wife's been buying a lot of purged library books as of the last 4 years, unfortunately.
Yeah,
but I agree. I mean, and a well-stocked library. Doing research at a library is a feeling that I think we get to say this now. Kids nowadays will not get to enjoy.
Right.
There's a certain smell associated to those little index cards that you flip through. And then you walk through to the section. You're looking for one book, but some other book may catch your eye in the section, and you start reading it.
Oh, exactly.
And before you know it, you spent 3 hours there reading.
There's something to be said for physically stumbling across adjacent works in a library, or physically stumbling across adjacent stores in a shopping center. The internet is great. It's vast, but it's so vast that you get very laser focused on stuff. It's harder to stumble across things now the way that you used to be able to in a library and discover, oh, there's a whole new section of the Dewey Decimal System right next to the movie making books, or right next to the gun. There's a gunsmithing section right next to the gun books. Oh, there's a ballistics and reloading section right next to the gun books. Yeah, the ways that you could stumble across stuff was interesting. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine, that we have allowed our library system in the States and other countries to get so politicized and be so purged, so that it doesn't reflect reality. It reflects a very specific culture, not the entirety of culture, because this is very important. So one of my things on my to-do list, if I ever have time and money, is to build public-private libraries, or perhaps private-public libraries that are open to the public, but they are maintained with private money so that they're not affected by the librarians' guilds that are actually, we should check in on the librarians' unions and see how they're doing, because I'm guessing, got a lot of USAID money. And they may not be as fully funded as they once were. So we should see how things are going in the library system later. But I don't want to interrupt your story, but there's another key aspect to your story that I find fascinating. So you had interest in the technical knowledge, and then you found yourself back in the States and got plugged into the practical application of privately owned firearms. But the other piece of this that's really interesting is your father. If I'm remembering the timeline correctly, when your father was in the States and running a restaurant, he was dealing with American crime, slightly different than Hong Kong crime, and he dealt with it in a somewhat American way.
Yeah, so the timeline. The audience is going to have to reconstruct this whole timeline. I'm really sorry. We just recorded this off the cuff. But yes, so as I was a boy, growing up in Texas, in Fort Worth, Texas, my father owned a restaurant. I still have very vague memories of the restaurant because I was very young. And the restaurant the building still exists. And I did not, as a boy, you don't think about the location, if it's good or bad. You just think about, it's just
a place. Yeah.
Daddy's restaurant. This is where he works with the other people who cook food. And everybody is very happy there. And they always give me sweets. That's what I remember. Those are great memories for a kid. I also remembered this one time when I found my father's pistol, and I didn't realize what it was because he never told us about a pistol. And this is actually a thing that it is a constant paranoia now that my kids, if you don't teach them the right things, that they would have unsupervised use of some of the hardware. I was playing with it, and I didn't know. As a small child? As a small child, yes. Mm-hmm. And this is not on my dad. I mean, he didn't grow up with guns. He thought he hit it well, but kids, you've got kids. You know how it is.
They're great at finding stuff, not stuff that you're looking for. They're great at finding everything else. But yes, yeah,
correct. And then they hide things for you too. So I was being a typical kid, like not a toddler. I think I was like 4 or 5 at that point. But I find things around the house, and I didn't realize that it was a real pistol. I didn't crank it off. He had the safety on it. I don't think he had anything in the chamber either. But still, as a boy growing up, I always had that memory because I still remember my dad running in the room, realizing what I had, and taking it from me and telling me that it's dangerous. I still remember that.
Interesting.
And so I, years later, after I came back to the States, my cousin had found it in some of my dad's stuff that he left around. And it, I don't know if I have it here. If I have it, I'll have to show it to you. It's he found it it's the most immigrant thing ever. He found a ginseng box, like an old school 1980s era wooden ginseng box. And they're usually really long because ginseng's a long root type of So it's a dried root usually. My dad had a couple rounds of ammo and a 25 ACP little Saturday night special. It's silver. It's like a chromed out Saturday night special.
Yeah.
But
classic stuff.
Yeah. So through the days of owning the restaurant, his restaurant was not in a nice part of town, but it was a place that fed us, and I'm very grateful for that. But because it was not in a nice part of town, he was a typical Chinese immigrant running the Chinese restaurant in a bad part of town, trying to get through and make it by and provide. How
did he come up with? Because he was a product of this Chinese culture from Hong Kong, where private weapons ownership is not really an option on the table. It's interesting to me that he was, I don't know what the right word is, open-minded enough, free-thinking enough, outside the box enough that he came to America, saw the problems, and was like, there's a solution to this problem, and it is my own firepower, my own protective capability.
Well, it wasn't his organic idea.
Okay.
He was very popular amongst the community because my dad's restaurant was always open. So there's a lot of guys who loved going by for the convenience, but also this is when there was still some Air Force facilities out in
okay. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, out in Fort Worth. And so there were a lot of service members and veterans who would come in to enjoy a succulent Chinese meal. And
they kind of took your dad under their wing and were like, hey, it's a rough part of town. Here's how you handle that around here in Texas.
He had a couple instances where biker gangs in that area were bad, and they would try to make him pay protection money. So after two instances where they try to ring him for protection money, the kitchen staff all came out with like cleavers and knives and surrounded the guy. And of course he left. But then that was one of those moments like, oh crap, this is actually happening. And one of his customers was he was a World War II Navy captain as in like skipper of the ship in '06. So Army equivalent of colonel. So he would not stand for that. He told my dad, you've got a young family. No, you've got to protect yourself. So he took him out to a flea market, and of all things, my dad bought a $25 25 ACP pistol. Again, understand from the perspective of an immigrant, a gun is a gun is a gun. That is better than meat cleavers and a kitchen staff, right. Especially when you're riding solo with a bag full of cash at 2 a.m. in the morning, trying to get home. So that little 25 ACP pistol, I like to keep around because I'd like to think that it kept my dad safe and it kept my dad in one piece to come back to me. And so I didn't know this until afterwards. My dad told me parts of the story after I came back to the States, after I came back from Hong Kong to the States. And I asked him about that one time, and he told me about, the backstory of that pistol and why that pistol came about. And so from Hong Kong coming back to the States, even after the interest in the technological employment side of firearms, the historical correlation of firearms, and in Hong Kong, it's one thing in the old world. It's different from here in the U.S. You could stroll down the road and see where the Japanese had fought the British troops. You can walk along a hiking trail and realize that this was a site of a massacre where the Japanese bayoneted, 80 to 100 Commonwealth service members who were in a medical facility. Like that is very much alive over there, that you could find old you could find artillery batteries, naval batteries with bullet holes all around the concrete. I mean, clearly a lot happened there. So the idea of firearms having a place is absolutely there, but not in peacetime, right? So then coming back to the States and talking to people, I initially brought that idea back with me. And part of it is the idealism that society will take care of you. And to a certain extent, yes, if it runs properly, yes. But as I've matured and gotten older, that is less of a thing that I would hedge upon for society to be a well-oiled machine, because I've seen it fall apart much more so than it running well. But when I first came back, that wasn't it. I mean, that was the 2000s. The Cold War had just ended. We were in this prosperity boom. Going through schooling and going on to college. I mean, everything was good. There were no real major wars. Yes, the global war on terror was around, but that was so far removed from American society. And so I remember having debates with my East Texas roommate and saying, yeah, I think it would be better. I love these things. I think they're cool, but I think it would be better if some of them were limited. And that's coming from someone who's grown up in that type of culture, to where you have zero actual contact with actual firearms, but more so, I had so much exposure to firearms technology, but I had no exposure to firearm culture. Is the main thing.
Yes.
And so coming to the States, I also had another friend in my dorm room who took me out to shoot. And this is the second time I've shot. The first time I shot, I was a tour group that I was in, went to China with, had bribed a PLA, People's Liberation Army range, and they gave us Type 56s, and I was just spraying ammo into the dirt after like paying the bribery money. But beside the point. The second time I shot
that's still extremely cool, though, we have to say. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's why the Type 56 holds a special place in my heart, because it's the first firearm I've ever shot. The first firearm I ever touched was a Sterling submachine gun. So it's those two sort of draw highlight of my background. But after that, I shot for the first time in the States, and it was at a farm shooting against some logs and some dirt that my friend built a hasty berm out of. And we had some targets stapled up, and we had some tin cans we were shooting at. We're shooting 22s and a 9mm pistol at these things. And my friend looked at me when I was shooting and commented that he wouldn't be able to tell that I never picked up a firearm before. Part of that is because of airsoft. Because with airsoft, you have a lot of dry training. The other side that got my friend very upset, and I would be very, very upset, and this part I've never told anyone outside of my friend. It's part of a shameful part of what I did, but it was out of ignorance. I took the 22 pistol, cranked it at a 30 degree into the horizon, and cranked a round off, just to see from the side how it would cycle. My friend immediately yelled at me, said, "What F are you doing?" Like, oh, just seeing how it works. And then he explained to me the idea of knowing what's beyond your target, and you don't know what's out there. You could have killed someone, the trajectory and how the bullet could travel. And, it's just, that's beyond my knowledge. So you're talking to someone, it's kind of like, you have so much book smart on something, but zero practical experience on it. And so at that moment, that was a moment that drew me, that drew that idea that, okay, this isn't just about learning about it in books. This is more than that. After that, I spent all my Christmases and Easters with my East Texas roommate. we'd go out hunting. We'd go to his farm. They had a range on their farm. We'd shoot on the farm. I started working with people in the service rifle club that was near our university. So I started learning some proper iron sight target shooting techniques. And there was a huge amount of that culture that was impossible for us to learn in places like Hong Kong, and dare I say, parts of Southern California, parts of Chicago, and parts of New York, where these things are completely, these are items that do not belong to that culture that's in those locations. A big part of it isn't the knowledge of how these things work. It's more so where they fit in the society, and how do you use these things. It's kind of like the driving culture is a big thing. Driving culture between us here and Europe and the Middle East is completely different. Driving in the Middle East is that's an experience.
Oh yes, Cairo is fascinating. There's 20 million people that live in Cairo. At any given moment, half of them are going to be in their cars, leaning on the horn, constantly, all hours of the day and night. It's something. Yeah,
Cairo is terrifying for driving. Honestly, anywhere in North Africa is just absolutely bonkers. But Cairo is one of the that's veteran mode for people to drive. This kind of goes back to our conversation on culture. One of the things that I have noticed, I probably shouldn't say what country it is, but it's in North Africa. I noticed very clearly, and then I asked about it and it was confirmed to me, people were very obedient at stopping at stoplights and stop signs if a policeman was there. Otherwise, that thing was invisible, completely inconsequential, had absolutely no effect whatsoever on the flow of traffic. And that was a little bit true in Egypt as well. There's just so much traffic in Cairo, though, that there has to be, like, they can't just run full throttle all the time. But if there is a police officer with a AMD 65 slung, then people stop at stop signs in Cairo and stoplights, and otherwise they kind of don't. The only thing that stops them is all the other traffic that hasn't stopped going the other way. But there are countries in North Africa where signs, rules are just not even worth thinking about unless there is some level of enforcement there. And so that is a kind of an interesting thing between this North African culture, Hong Kong culture, where the rules are sacrosanct, even if the stop sign has been down for days. The obedience to the rules and the expectations that are there. And then here in America, where it's like halfway in between, is kind of interesting. Hong Kong driving culture is definitely more. If there's a sign that's down, especially the taxis, it's North Africa type.
Oh, okay.
I would say probably Germany. If you go to Germany,
Germany's more okay.
Yeah, Germany. Even if you have even if there's no police officer there, everything would just. There's no sign, no police officer. People would still respect how to drive. That's one of the big reasons why they get so pissed off at foreigners on the Autobahn, because the foreigners don't know the local customs of driving on the Autobahn, and they just do whatever. They just think they know on the road.
Well, on the culture side of things, this is so fascinating to me, just the way that different aspects of the culture play out. And something that I've always wondered about, because there are, you mentioned a few minutes ago, the benefits of the not necessarily communism, but the Chinese collectivism that is baked in from Confucius, just different dynasties in the over the centuries. The sense of community that is built in, and a level of trust and expectation in the community or the community authorities to solve things, is really interesting. And it does have pros and cons. And it's one of the reasons I think Maoism is going to last longer than I'm trying to think of the dates now. It integrates better with Chinese culture than the Marxism and Trotskyism and Stalinism, like these are all attempts to try to get it to work with the Eastern European culture of Russia. But the Maoism integrates much better with the pre-existing culture. So I think that's part of the reason that it works better and is going to last longer. And I say works better because it isn't. It has fundamental falsehoods and fundamental injustices that are baked into it, but it hasn't fallen apart yet. So one of the things that's interesting is how do we deal with this? Because centralization has advantages, short-term advantages, or advantages that come at a great cost. So when you see centralization being used to drive, say, military production before World War II in Germany and in the USSR and other places, like, oh yeah, it's amazing what that gets done in a short amount of time, but it's not a sustainable thing. How do we build, how do we figure out what to make of these things and take away from them? And I think that you have two stories that go really well together. One is in Hong Kong, you have crime and the expectation of some organized, top-down organized society is going to solve it. And so we don't go and buy guns. We don't solve it ourselves. Over in Texas, meanwhile, you have a bad part of Fort Worth. And you have a guy running a restaurant. And you have his cooks in the back with their cleavers. They're part of a community. And then you have his customers. You have a guy who's able to come along and say, listen, here's how you need to handle this. And I'm going to help you get the right, or a gun. I believe that a mistake that Americans often make is we look at the downfalls of collectivism and we say the antidote to that, the alternative to that is individualism. And from a legal perspective, I think that's correct. You have individual rights, not collective rights. But from an actual practical application point, I think that the alternative or opposite of the collectivism is some level of not top-down control, but bottom-up, decentralized, organic community, where the way that we solve a crime problem in a Chinese restaurant is not a collective, empowering of the Fort Worth Police Department to have more authority or more weapons, or we collectively treat biker gangs differently now because of that one guy. No, organically we come along and we start with meat cleavers and then we end up with better tools. Well, that's something that I love about this story that I've been tinkering with, for a long time, and I love seeing the ways that this plays out in different ways. In history and in real personal ways.
Well, I think one of the big things that we're looking at, one of the biggest revolutions that we've seen in informational exchange has been the internet. And while back when my dad had a restaurant, nobody went around and told you, oh, that 25 ACP pistol is crap, like you shouldn't buy that. Yeah. No, it was a pistol. Unless you were really into it, and unfortunately, that's also back in the day how some not very good takes were perpetuated in the knowledge base, like the M14 being inherently accurate. That's how I learned the very difficult way that it's not true. The internet, however, has a way of when you run it the way the American society does, or the Free West society does, it has its way of it has its good and its bad, right? On one side, you see a lot of ash and trash, a lot of it. So you may see a lot more nasty things if it's unpoliced, per se. But then at the same time, you will also be able to find communities that are actually full of knowledge. And it's like finding an oasis in a desert. And that itself is worth its weight in gold. And part of it, why as far as our channel, we are very selective, or we are very strict on how we let people into our Discord on our side, because it's not that we don't want to share it with other people per se, but we've had bad experiences to where someone just comes in and just wrecks house, and it just takes one or two people like that. But the internet's it's got a funny way of interesting way of transmitting information to people far away, kind of to where it could kind of like what you guys are doing, inspiring people to build their communities towards for the better. But then at the end of the day, leadership is still leadership. You still need people in that community who have that leadership to lead it, no matter what type of what kind of hard skills you have. And so that's the big element that the internet right now, I think with social media has been hindering us is the development of leaders in the younger generation. And that's honestly, in looking at how, community development and how to, it takes, in my opinion, it takes the community elders, it takes parents, it takes people who have wisdom and experience, who've lived life, to pass these things on to the younger generation to build them into becoming leaders. And that's one thing. It's in a collective, in the Chinese Confucius society, it pushes the younger generation to be more obedient. Now, that's got a downside, but the upside is it pushes them to listen to some of those good or bad
the elders,
yes, that they've had.
Yeah.
Now, the very bad thing of that is that it doesn't develop a lot of their creativity as much as the West. And so I think both sides have certain traits that both sides could learn from. Whether we do it or not, or completely sidestep it because we think the internet with its infinite knowledge could take the place of a human leader. Yeah. I mean, that's for us to decide.
Here's what I think the difference between a community and a collective society is that there is personal responsibility. There's enough individualism for personal responsibility to think. If you get rid of individualism completely, no one will be personally responsible for a thing. So the Confucian system, I think, has a neat little trick around that, which is elders get special privileges, elders get special respect. So you end up with some responsibility falling on people, and then it has some downsides. But if you have people who take personal responsibility to step into a situation like a Chinese restaurant and a biker gang, that's where you actually have the community element working positively because personal responsibility is being taken by some people. But it doesn't have to be your grandfather. It can be just a Navy captain standing up and saying, "Hey, kid, don't let those guys push you around like that, and I'm going to help you out. We're going to do this. We're going to do this." So the ability or the desire for that captain to stand up and take that responsibility or take that role in the community disappears if he has no individual responsibility. And it's another thing that firearms teach. You're responsible for every bullet that leaves the barrel, whether you're hitting a target, you got to know what's beyond the target. If you're shooting bullets sort of up into the sky, you're responsible for every bullet that comes out. There are so many aspects to the firearm debate, the conversation, the equipment that reinforce personal responsibility and the rights and the responsibilities that go together. So that's one of the reasons that guns need to be culturally eradicated, not just physically hard to get to, for certain people, for certain political ideologies.
So I think one thing to add to your point on the community versus the individual doing right, the American society especially, and I've seen this in the U.S. more so than Europe, more so than the Middle East and North Africa and the Far East. Maybe some of it in Japan. I've seen some Japanese people like this, but the calling to step up, to do something right in America is immense compared to some of these other countries. And one of the reasons why I love living here, love being around that, is I like being around people who want to do right. I'm not saying that people would do wrong in other cultures, but there seems to be more of a cultural faux pas to step into somebody else's business. Okay, this is a tricky topic. I'm not saying to invade Iraq to spread democracy. That's not what I'm talking about here.
Right.
I'm talking individually in a community. If you see someone in a car wreck in America, you will get multiple people stopping to try to pull people out of a burning car. That's just the culture in the US. That's not a culture you would get in China. Maybe every now and then, but that's just not the. It's let the police officers or let the firefighters handle it. That's more of the culture over there. And so this is a vital piece of the American culture that I think makes the firearms ownership work. Are people willing to step out and put themselves out there to do right? Yeah. Now, obviously, that's not everybody. There are some scumbags around America, of course.
Well, and and I was going to say it isn't everybody, not because of a few bad apples. It isn't everybody because we have essentially two camps in America. Obviously, it's way more than that. But there are essentially, in this general debate about individualism, collectivism, community, we kind of have two camps. And we definitely have a camp in the United States that says, let the authorities do the thing and don't ever go against the authorities. And as it relates to gun culture, did you see the article in the New York Times talking about GunTube?
I didn't read through it. I know that they were fascinated that there's people who publish these things, but they decided to look at all the channels that were a lot of the entertainment channels rather than the educational channels.
They looked at the big ones, and part of the reason for that was I talked to the reporter, Thomas Gibbons Neff, and he found it difficult to convince his editors that this was happening, that GunTube existed. So he showed them Grand Thumb and Brandon Herrera and Demolition Ranch. He showed them the 12 million subscriber YouTube channels to prove to them, yes, this is real. And if you look at, in some ways, I thought Thomas did a great job with the article, but if you look at the comments on the article from the New York Times readers, you see that there are definitely people in the United States who have just as much of a firearms are intrinsically, ontologically evil devices if they're ever in the hands of private citizens. Private citizens should never own these things or talk about these things. Very much, not that I was in Hong Kong in the 80s, but that is baked into a section of the American population to such a deep level that, YouTube should not allow people to talk about a hobby that is legal and they enjoy, because it just shouldn't be an option for people to have this as a hobby, let alone as a defense of a intrinsic human right. So we do have these different pockets of different cultures that are here. And it would be real easy to just talk about the surface level stuff, just argue with people in the comment sections. But I would like to get deeper, in conversations with folks about what it is that we're actually talking about, because ultimately, I think you have a great, observation that has developed over all sorts of experiences in all sorts of different places, and seeing how these cultures play out. Individualistic, community-based, collective, highly ordered and structured by either top-down actual physical military control or just lots of really hard-baked cultural expectations. You really need kind of total control, because guns are not going away, and it's only getting easier to make guns, and it's only getting easier to learn about the technical side of guns. So gun control honestly has to stop happening at the serialized component level. If the gun control people are going to prevail, it's going to be at the cultural level, where you remove thinking about the responsibilities and the rights, the basic practical application, the bias level stuff. If you remove that from people completely, that's the only way that you will get the kind of society where gun control works. And I'm putting that in quotation marks for the people who can't see the video, where gun control works, because there isn't going to be actual control of the physical weapons. Right. And even if you did manage to like lock down all of Hong Kong, people would still be chopping each other up with watermelon knives. So it's this cultural fight is the real fight. The cultural conversation is the real battle. And then some of the stuff that happens legislatively is the symptoms of that. It's the distant outworkings of that conversation.
So part of it, kind of like what I was saying earlier in the evangelization concept of how I came to firearms. How do you convince someone who's grown up in a society? You can give him all the technical knowledge, all the historical examples of cool firearms, and they are certainly very cool and really neat. I cannot believe I get to own and work with so many things, because back in the day we just didn't have it. But how do you take someone and push him to the peak of, well, it wasn't the peak, but as much technological knowledge about firearms, and he still doesn't like the idea of civilians to own firearms? It's not about whether these things exist. It's not about how these things work. It's more so about what you're saying, the culture, the acceptance that these things are a useful part of society. And a big part of it, a big fear that a lot of people have, is the lack of exposure to firearms itself. So when people, and this is, I get to be political on this channel that I usually don't. I'm not necessarily, but just giving an opinion here. When you're going out there and protesting with your AR strapped to your chest, someone who culturally disapproves of that thing, you're not going to convince them anything at all. Rather, I have friends from the UK who come over, and the first thing they say, "Henry, do you have an AR-15?" I was like, "Oh, do I?"
Yes, yeah. Good question.
I don't agree with these things, but I'd really much like to experience the AR-15 if you could. Yes, let's go. And then you take them out and
have
you
realize, accepted then you ask them if they would accept the gospel of Eugene Stoner into their hearts. Yes.
Well, it's slow, right? It's slow, and honestly,
it's slow, but it is amazing to me how much just physical, and yes, seeing an AR-15 or an AK-47 strapped to somebody's chest in a already tense protest does not make a connection. Right. But being able to touch one, being able to cycle it, being confident that this is a safe environment, being able to wear the ear protection and the eye protection and see somebody else do it and have an understanding, like, this is an incredibly valuable familiarization opportunity. And with familiarization comes less fear and less trepidation. And then once you're less emotionally afraid of it, now you can mentally play with some of the practical applications of this stuff. So I think that is really, really effective. If you can talk to somebody about the thing and take away a lot of the mystery of the thing and take away a lot of the scariness of the thing stops being an obstacle and it starts, then you can get to the actual conversation a little better.
Yeah, I also think it's important to listen. Listen to what some people are worried about, rather than trying to just tell them, no, this is it. No, it doesn't work in a marriage. It doesn't work with, leadership to just tell someone. Well, I mean, in China it does, I suppose. But over here, it works to work as a community and understanding what someone's concerns are, I think that is a good start to developing an idea of why do these cultures have this idea of firearms. But then also, if someone does show interest in the firearm or in shooting or in self-protection or anything like that, I'll use my wife as an example. She is married to a man who has some hardware, let's just say. I have told her many a times that PDWs are probably better for her if she ever wants to go shooting. Does she ever shoot my PDWs? Never. She likes to shoot her Glock. Okay. Don't force the PDWs at this point. Let them discover slowly, because that quickly turns into this thing where they don't want to right. develop an adverse idea about it. So AR-15s are amazing. At this point, it's just amazing for us to live through the idea that back in the 2000s, the AR-15 was this really high dollar item, whereas the AK was this cheap thing. If you want to build up to, the American standard, it takes some money. Now it is entirely different. You have the most efficient, the easiest to use rifle, readily available for the price that is sometimes cheaper than a Glock. Yep. Amazing.
Palmetto State Armory deals.
Yes.
There's always a Palmetto State Armory deal. And when it's an AR-15, $400.
Yeah, but the point is,
$300. Yeah.
But the point here is, even if they live in a state that doesn't ban these things, that doesn't legally make it difficult, don't just go straight ahead and push. You need to get this. You need to get this. You need to get this. Suggest.
Start removing obstacles. Yeah. You can start removing obstacles gently, one at a time. It's great that price is an obstacle that has largely been taken away. Some of the legal obstacles have been taken away. The educational side is much better now. But the thing that I love, and this isn't even necessarily true about firearms. You can start this conversation with other things, with other powerful, dangerous, scary tools. I think that one of the objections to firearms is largely selfish. So I don't want to call everybody who is opposed to firearms necessarily selfish, but it is I really don't want. So guns are great at solving problems, but I really don't want that problem to be my problem. That's just unpleasant to think about. I'd really like the problem of the biker gang, or the problem of this, or the problem of that. That's such a big problem. I really want that to be somebody else's problem. And so going straight to the heart of the matter of this is so that you can handle those problems because it's really your responsibility is very daunting. But that is the key heart of the issue. And then the other aspect to that is, if I misuse a firearm and a bullet hits an innocent bystander, or I don't know what I'm doing and I hurt myself, like that's a level of responsibility that I also don't want. I really don't want to be in control, personal control of something that is so powerful and so dangerous, because I don't want the responsibility of that. And that's the one where demystifying some of the weapon helps. But the bigger thing is I think getting people more comfortable with some of the responsibilities without minimizing them, where it's like, yes, the AR-15 isn't going to explode and kill you. However, it does kill people. You are responsible for every bullet. And turning that into a thought process for the person, where they think through their responsibilities in a way where they are willing to take them on. And that is, ultimately, that is, I think, the biggest hill. And it also ties us neatly back to your gospel analogy. You will never appreciate the gospel of Jesus Christ if you do not accept your own sin and need for a savior. You will never accept firearms as a tool to help you with your personal responsibilities if you will not accept that they are in fact your responsibilities.
Yeah. I mean, part of that,
they could be fun, but they're never going to be a life-saving tool if your life is not your responsibility and your neighbor's life is not your responsibility. they're just going to be a fun thing. And so, but that key conversation needs to happen, because there's a lot more to this conversation than just guns, firearms.
Yeah, I mean,
ballistically propelled kinetic devices.
A big thing of this is also, the maturity of the recipient, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have the maturity to accept responsibility for, let's say, like driving, doing taxes, or anything like that, I mean, I wouldn't expect someone to then accept the responsibility of potentially taking life if they needed to.
Right. Yeah.
And so, I mean, maturity has a huge factor to play into this, and that's something that the internet cannot help you mature. Life helps you mature. You help yourself mature. That is entirely up to whomever it is out there. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, a lot of people, what I've seen at least, I don't know if it's really a lot of people, but a lot of very vocal people I've seen talking about people in California, in New York, and saying, "Oh, just get out of there." That's just not a very realistic way of approaching this. It's kind of like telling someone, "Oh, you live in North Korea, just get out of there."
Right. Yeah.
That's not how it works. That's not how life works.
Yeah. And it doesn't address the issue that North Korea is being unjust to its citizens. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, like looking at this with a decent level of compassion, I think the big thing is if we're able to see someone that they don't approach the firearms legislative side as with malice, thinking that, I want to cripple this society, so I'm going to push this through. I want to, I don't know, make a lot of money running this fake nonprofit that preys upon people's feelings and emotions. Mm-hmm. Like if you're talking to someone like that, you're not talking, that's a psychopath. But when we're talking to normal people, the person that we're talking about who sees an accident, they want to go and help someone get out of the car, or at the very least, they want to call 911 so someone can come help. That's a person I think that we should be talking to, because that person, even if they disapprove of firearms, they still have it in them as a human being that they want to be a decent person. And I think if you're looking at that, you look at a lot of people I grew up with in Hong Kong who deeply oppose firearms. I see a lot of people like that. In fact, people nowadays, you look at the Chinese gangs, the triads, you're like, oh, they're so bad. They're bringing drugs in and doing like this human trafficking and stuff like that. Triads they didn't start by, oh, let me scheme to see how we can bring drugs in and bring, legal slave labor in. No, that's not how it started. It started because there were vulnerable Chinese communities, and they had to band together to provide security. Kind of like USAID probably started in a different way, and then it kind of spun into something else. So I find it, if I'm looking at someone, and even if they say, oh, I disagree with you on this, that's okay. I wonder what their core principles are and what we could start from there. Instead of, no, you need an AR-15. No, you're wrong. Like that's just not the right way of just not even building community, just approaching, being a human being and talking to other people. I don't know if the internet has helped us or hurt us in that aspect, though.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that it has been a polarizing thing, and it has been massively helpful for certain communities that already had community, and they already had some understanding of responsibility. And I think it's been remarkably destructive to people that didn't have discipline or didn't have community or didn't have things, because as you mentioned, there's a bunch of stuff you can't learn on the internet. If you can make friends on the internet. We met on the internet, actually. You can make friends on the internet, but you can't really have community on the internet. it isn't going to do the same things for you. It just has the semblance of it. Having 400 friends on Facebook is not the same as having a real friend in real life. But it feels like it should be the same, or even if it's not quite as good, you have 4 times as many of them. So surely it'll be fine. So I think that it's been a very polarizing thing in that it's been a massive benefit to a lot of people. T-Rex Arms would not exist as a company without the internet. Our business model doesn't work as a gun store in Centerville, Tennessee. But there are these downsides. And I think that's part of the reason that we're seeing polarization in the country. It isn't just a Republican Democrat thing. It is different groups, and different individuals, different communities, have been pulled in different directions by technological developments, which means that, if you're like me, which I am, and if you're like you, Henry, which I know that you are, and you believe in community, there's lots more work that needs to get done, because a lot of pulling together is what actually needs to happen to solve that problem. Not just arguing with people on the internet. Turns out to not be the ultimate solution.
Yeah, look, I'll put it this way: that gang that my dad. Or not gang, the gang of cooks that my dad had who came out to protect him, he didn't have to order them to go out.
Right. Yeah.
They came out to his aid because they wanted to make sure he's okay. They saw that he was in trouble. Most of his staff were Mexican dudes, like come from different cultures. But they were able to communicate and bond and form this one organization together. I mean, a good part of it is it's for profit, but it's more than that. If it's just purely for profit, they wouldn't go out with their meat cleavers and risk their lives standing in front of a biker gang to make sure he didn't get shot or killed.
Right.
So
yeah,
it's important to develop relationships like that. And a lot of the cultures, just because you come from a location doesn't mean that is what you're programmed for life.
Yes.
And so,
yeah.
And another part of it, I mean, T-Rex Arms, this culture wasn't around in the 2000s. Like, it was not like this. The Second Amendment community was not the Second Amendment community is nowadays. And so even T-Rex Arms, I'd say 10, 15 years ago was more on the fringe than it is now, more closer to what the core beliefs of a lot of people are. So a lot of that comes down to figuring out sort of, what you believe, and then let other people figure out that they also agree with you. So I think in the long term, I mean, a lot of that we don't want to be impatient about these things. And a good part of it comes down to listening and talking to someone and understanding where they're coming from.
Yes. That is a great way to finish this episode. So thank you so much, Henry. I really appreciated getting deeper into your story, and it's got so many interesting aspects to it, and how nicely it dovetails with some of the other conversations that we've had. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing on the technical side of educating people on weapons systems and weapons platforms and ballistics and history. But I also love that we are able to have these kind of conversations about the culture and the community, because that is really at the heart of the thing that we want to accomplish. It's easy to get focused on the really fascinating history of a particular, say, round, and then the sheer physics of what it can accomplish. But that's something that's designed to solve a problem. It's not something that exists in a vacuum. And so I want to make sure that we never lose sight of that fact, and get tunnel vision. We're not just here to talk about minutia. We would like to see benefit to a community, and one of those benefits is we'd like to see communities exist, and not just clumps of individuals or human resources under a collective top-down organization aligned by district and regulation. So So Henry, thank you so much for your time. Anyone listening to this, my biggest recommendation to you is not actually to go out and make somebody shoot a gun with you, but get plugged into a community. Whether it's short order cooks at a Chinese restaurant who need some backup in a tense moment, get plugged into your communities.
Yeah. Talk to people. Just nowadays there's this adverse reaction to people talking to people. If I didn't like to talk to people, I would have never met my wife. And that is the single most amazing change in my life that I've ever had. And so you never know who you'd meet. Now, I mean, there are people who have significant issues out there. I'm not saying to be.
You can find them even in the gun industry. Yes, it's true. Yeah.
So again, those people may need help, right? Also understand that it's not just opening your house to anyone out there to trash, but don't be adverse to talking to people and listening to what they have to say. I think it's at the end of the day that one side, and that one side of my personality that I've been blessed with is getting to talk to someone and understand and want to learn about them. And that's been something that has proven to be very, very valuable in learning how the world works as I traveled in Eastern, Western Europe, in Afghanistan, the Middle East, North Africa, all around America, all around Asia, and getting to talk to people and try to understand where they're coming from. That one aspect is, I think, one of the biggest things that has had a positive impact in my life, is realizing that I can talk to someone. But again, take that with a grain of salt. Don't put yourself in positions.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you so much for listening, everybody. And thank you so much, Henry, for being on the show and continuing to have these conversations with me publicly and privately. I appreciate it tremendously.
Yeah, no, it's been awesome. I mean, we only went over 1 hour, but I had a fantastic time, and I appreciate you bringing me on. We'll text more and we'll kind of chat more and see if there's any other topics. This is like the tip of the iceberg of our conversations today. So,
tip of the iceberg, absolutely.
Yeah.